Welcome everybody to Finding Truth. Tonight we're going to be having a good conversation between Dustin and Joseph about Mormonism, historical arguments for and against it, and also philosophy. So if you guys are ready, we're just going to go and jump right into it. Dustin, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience, and then Joseph, you can go next after him.
Yeah, so I'm Dustin Crummett. I got a PhD from Notre Dame a couple years ago. I recently have finished a postdoc at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. I think I know where I'm going next, but it's not for sure yet, so I probably shouldn't say. But I'm moving somewhere. And I work in philosophy of religion and in ethics and political philosophy. I don't have any specific focus on Mormonism, and I'm not a historian. So, I'll be interested in hearing what Joseph has to say. People who are sort of really interested in the sort of stuff I'm going to say, I would recommend that they maybe look into somebody like Dan Vogel, for instance, because I'm certainly very much an amateur. But
all right, well, Joseph, why don't you go ahead and take it over, introduce yourself, let us know what you want to, about your background or anything like that.
Sure, thanks. And thanks for having me on, by the way. My name is Joseph Lawal. I'm a lifelong member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm a student in philosophy and classical studies on the classical studies side, an emphasis on the language, so Latin and Greek. In philosophy, I'm mostly interested in philosophy of language and kind of its intersection with metaphysics and epistemology, and then also philosophy of religion. And like Dustin, I'm not a professional historian. So like him, I focus in philosophy. And so, I think that'll reflect in actually the way I approach these questions tonight. But same as Dustin, I would say that for people watching, when we get into historical issues, it's obviously there are specific datum, right, that are relevant. And so, it's something that everyone who wants to get in on the conversation should investigate for themselves, because neither of us are professional historians. So what we say here is certainly not definitive on the issue.
All right, Dustin, so why don't you go ahead and basically you're going to get us started with some of the objections that you have to Mormonism. And then what we're going to do after that is basically let Joseph respond, and then we'll go from there.
Mm-hmm. So I'm specifically going to be focusing, because this is just what we talked about, on sort of historical worries that I have. I take it that the LDS Church, takes itself to be sort of the one church pleasing to God that's been restored after other churches have apostatized, the sort of stuff. I want to argue in the other direction. I don't think we should accord any sort of special prophetic authority to Joseph Smith or to the LDS Church, or any sort of special ecclesial authority or anything like that, which wouldn't entail that there was nothing of value in Mormonism, but it would be an important thing to know, at least, nonetheless, right? And specifically, I want to try to argue for two things. One is that kind of the most notable method through which Joseph Smith produced purported revelation was translating these supposed ancient documents, and then they produced Holy Scripture. I want to argue that we know that he wasn't really doing that, even though he said that he was doing that. And then I want to argue that we know that he was pretty dishonest on a range of issues that are often pretty directly related to his credibility on religious matters. And when we combine those two things, I think that pretty well sinks his credibility, in my view. So regarding translations, I want to focus on two things. One is, and then I want to focus on two documents that he supposedly translated. The first is the Book of Abraham. This is supposedly translated from some papyri he bought. At the time, nobody in North America could read them because they didn't know the hieroglyphics. Now we can read them. It turns out his translation is totally wrong. Supposedly, these were documents written by Abraham way back. They're not. They're from the Book of the Dead. They're not from the right time period to have been written by Abraham. So all of that completely wrong. The Book of Mormon is a little more complex, but first of all, I want to say we know that he couldn't have really translated it from golden plates because the civilization that's supposed to have produced the golden plates never existed. So the Book of Mormon purports to be from these civilizations that lasted for thousands of years, that were made up of millions of white Hebrew-speaking, Egyptian-writing Israelites in the Americas who, there are a lot of anachronisms. They have horses and chariots and steel swords, and I know Mormon apologists have explanations for that. But when you look at mainstream archaeology, genetics, philology, anthropology, no trace that these people ever existed, where surely we would expect them to have left some trace somewhere, right? On the other hand, the idea that, the basic structure of the Book of Mormon fits very well with the sort of thing that somebody in Joseph Smith's context might have made up. People believed in what was called the myth of the mound builders. They looked and they saw these Native American burial mounds and earthworks and things, and they thought, the Native Americans couldn't have made that because people were racist. They must have been made by white people, and the white people were wiped out by, the dark-skinned Native Americans we see around us. And this is what happens in the Book of Mormon. Some of the Nephites, I guess, are cursed with dark skin by God, which doesn't seem, well, anyway. And ultimately wipe out the more advanced Nephites. The people also wondered, well, where did the Native Americans come from? And they looked in the Bible. Oh, maybe they're the lost tribes of Israel. And this also shows up in the Book of Mormon, right? So there's this book called The View of the Hebrews that a lot of people think Joseph Smith plagiarized. I don't know if he plagiarized it or not, but there's a lot of similarity. It came out just a little bit before the Book of Mormon, and it shows you that there was all of these ideas were in the air. So when you find something that fits very well with 19th century American folklore, but doesn't fit at all with empirical reality as we try to study it, it seems like it probably has its origin in folklore, namely in being made up by Joseph Smith. Another worry, lots of plagiarism from the King James Version of the Bible, very long passages that include translation errors and manuscript errors and things. Why do these plates buried in America in the 5th century contain errors that are found in the King James Bible that's made 1,200 years later in England? Things that don't make any sense in context. This passage where Jesus says, whoever says to his brother Raka shall be in danger of the council. When he said it in Palestine, that means the Sanhedrin Council, but of course there's no Sanhedrin in North America. Why is he talking to these people about the council? Looks like probably Joseph Smith just copied this out of the King James Bible rather than getting it from golden plates. A final worry, this famous story about the lost manuscript pages. So Martin Harris took home 116 pages when they were transcribing the Book of Mormon, took home 116 pages. They went missing. Probably his wife burned them. We don't know exactly, but there's immediately this worry. Well, if he's really translating, it seems like he should be able to reproduce the pages. If he's making it up extemporaneously, he won't be able to. Well, what he said is that an angel came to him and said evil men had taken the pages, and if he tried to reproduce them, they were going to alter the original pages to make it look like he had been inconsistent. And then they would release him to discredit them. So in fact, the angel said he had to translate from these other plates that have the same story, but in like different words, and it's a little shorter. But I mean, that seems awfully convenient for Joseph Smith. We don't have any evidence of these evil men or of their ability to get the manuscript pages or of their ability to make alterations in this manuscript that was written in ink in somebody else's handwriting without them being noticed. So it seems like, to me, he probably just made that part up. We also know, and this will be the last thing I'll talk about on translation issues, we also know that he got spoofed sometimes. So Henry Caswell was this professor. He went to Nauvoo in 1842. He says he showed Joseph Smith a Greek Psalter, like a Greek book of the Psalms. And Joseph Smith said, that's a reformed Egyptian dictionary with hieroglyphics, just like on the golden plates. Well, of course not. This was Greek. He was just making that up, it seems like. The next year, these guys unearthed what were called the Kinderhook plates, which were, just like the golden plates, these, Native American plates with symbols on them. According to his scribe, William Clayton, he said that he began translating them, found that they contain the history of the person with whom they were found, a descendant of Ham through the loins of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Later on, one of the people who unearthed them came out and said that it was a hoax. Mormon apologists said, no, this guy is lying. They're authentic. It took until 1980. There was scientific testing. It was proven that they were a hoax that Joseph Smith had apparently fallen for. So not only are there a lot of suspicions about the things that he did translate, he also fell for these spoofs. Turning to sort of general questions about Joseph Smith. I mean, you might think, well, maybe he was still receiving revelations, but he was just mistaken about the method or something. But I'm much more skeptical of that. I mean, I'm skeptical of that to begin with, but I'm much more skeptical of that when we look at the fact that he doesn't seem that trustworthy to me on other matters. So when he was young, he used to do treasure digging. So he would put like a magical stone in a hat and look in the hat, put his head in the hat, and supposedly he could see where treasure was buried. And people would pay him to tell them where treasure was buried so they could go find treasure. Well, of course, he wasn't seeing anything because nobody ever found any treasure. So was he just somehow mistaken, or was he deceiving people? And I think he was probably deceiving people. So here's one reason why. He was put on trial for this because it was illegal. And one of the friendly witnesses, I mean, there were several witnesses who testified, no, he really can see stuff. So it's not a scam, right? One of them was Josiah Stoll, and he said, well, look, Joseph Smith saw in his hat a treasure chest with a feather on top of it. And we went and we dug it up, and the treasure chest was gone. This was a common, people thought that the guardian spirits of the treasure could make the treasure sink when you were digging for it. And this is how treasure diggers would explain why nobody ever found any treasure. But we didn't find the treasure chest, but we did find the feather that he described. Well, I mean, if you dig in a random place, you're not just going to find a feather underground. So either Joseph Smith really saw a treasure that presumably was moved by a guardian spirit of the treasure, and that doesn't seem very plausible, or he planted the feather to make it look like, we were so close, I really did see something. If he planted the feather, then he was being deceptive. A bit after his trial, he promised his future father-in-law that he was going to give up treasure digging. The next year, he digs up the golden plates. He begins translating them using the exact same method, putting a stone in a hat and looking at it, and supposedly he could see in English what the golden plates said. And the story of the golden plates fits in with treasure digger lore and other ways. There's this angel that guards them, just like a guardian spirit, this sort of stuff. So that really makes it seem like he was running a scam, and then with the treasure digging, and then it's very suspicious that his religious efforts look so similar to the treasure digging and begin immediately afterwards, right? It makes it feel like maybe he just took up another fraud. He also, he supposedly had a vision when he was a teenager. His story about the vision changes. It was influential for him in some way. But the original version in 1832, and this is written in his own handwriting, has it that he had already determined that all the other churches were wrong by reading the Bible. And he prays for the forgiveness of his sins, and the Lord appears and says the world's very sinful, but your sins are forgiven, blah, 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 something like that. In 1838, when he tells the story, there are two people, God the Father and Jesus, as separate figures. And he asks, which church should I join? Because he says it had never occurred to me that they were all wrong. And then God tells him, or maybe Jesus tells him, you shouldn't join any of them. They're all wrong. They're led by corrupt men. Their creeds are an abomination. And then there are other changes to the story in other contexts. But the point is, sure, when somebody tells a story many different times, there are going to be variations and whatever. It seems hard for me to believe that you would get confused, say, about whether God the Father and Jesus were both in your vision as different people, or whether they told you that all the other churches were wrong. And it also seems like you wouldn't just leave that out. I mean, it's pretty important information when you're describing the vision, right? So that suggests to me that he's adding elements to the vision to serve his own purposes later on. God the Father and Jesus being different fit with his changing ideas about the Trinity too. But that means that he's willing to falsely say that things have been told to him by God in visions, and that is a really big hit to his credibility. Final thing that I want to mention is the polygamy stuff. So we know that he lied about whether he was practicing polygamy. He lied about it repeatedly. He had other people lie for him. He excommunicated people for talking about it. His death was triggered by his getting a town council to go smash up this newspaper's printing press because they were talking about it and some other stuff he didn't want them to talk about. That led to a chain of events we don't need to get into. But so he lied about that. I also think he lied about getting the revelation that he should practice polygamy. I don't think that at least the way that he practiced it, which seems to me to have been really very bad, very exploitative, manipulative, predatory. I don't think God would have commanded him to do that, but you can easily imagine why somebody would say that God commanded you to do that, right? So we know that he supposedly got this revelation sometime around the time that he was having an affair or secret marriage with Fanny Alger, who was the Smith's housekeeper. 17-year-old, or maybe a little older. We don't know exactly when it happened, but she was a teenager. So that it's awfully, and his wife didn't know about this to begin with. It's awfully convenient that he gets the revelation around this time. His wife didn't know about a lot of his other wives. The LDS Church website talking about this describes it all as an excruciating ordeal for her. He ultimately married probably around 34 women. 11 of them were married to other men. First, 7 of them were teenagers. He told women that they and their families would get eternal life if they married him, stuff like this. There was an incident where he went to Heber Kimball, and we have Heber Kimball's own description of this, and said, I need to marry your wife, God says so. And Heber Kimball was so upset, he didn't eat or drink for 3 days. He says, finally, he went to Joseph Smith and said, I'll do it if God says so. Joseph Smith said, you passed the test. I don't really need to marry your wife. But then they decided that he needed to marry his 14-year-old daughter, who was, Joseph Smith was 37 at this time, and this was an age gap that was unusual even in the olden days. They went to the daughter, said, the family will get eternal life if you agree to marry Joseph Smith, and you have 48 hours to decide, and she agreed to marry him. That seems really messed up to me. Some of his marriages were sealings for eternity only, which I guess means that you don't have sex until the afterlife, something like that. I won't pronounce on all the specifics, but some of them were not chaste. Some of them he did have sex with them, and again, the LDS Church website admits that that's probably true. So that whole affair seems awfully bad to me. And I think it suggests that he was and he claimed that he was commanded to commit polygamy by an angel with a flaming sword. So it's hard to be honestly mistaken about that. I think he was mistaken, and I think it must not have been an honest mistake. It really served some not very good interests that he had. So to recap, it seems to me when we can actually check Joseph Smith's supposed revelations in the form of translations, they don't check out, and then he doesn't seem credible on these other issues. He did some really bad stuff, and so that seems to me, like I said, to sink his credibility. So that's there's a lot more that I would like to talk about, of course, but that's sort of the overview.
All right. Well, Joseph, you're going to get a chance to respond to some of these things, and perhaps if you have any questions to clarify some of the things that Dustin said, then you can go ahead and basically have a back and forth with him as far as having a conversation between the two of you guys, and then we'll just go from there.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. So what I'll do, I think, as the three of us discussed what we were kind of hoping to do with this video, what we decided on was that basically because of the way that I approach these sorts of questions, was that Dustin would lay out what he thinks are some compelling historical reasons to reject the church, as he just did the LDS Church, right? And then I would focus on why I think historical reasons like this are generally not the best grounds for deciding religious questions on. So I think, I'm hoping that we'll spend a lot of time talking about some kind of more broader methodological and epistemological concerns. But what I can do is give just kind of a sketch of a couple of answers to a couple of these questions on historical grounds, and then I'll talk about kind of, like I said, broader epistemological concerns. Obviously you raised a lot of issues, Dustin, a lot of different, quite disparate sets of issues, and some of them I think are kind of non-issues, but they're raised quite often as objections to the Latter-day Saint position. Others I think are serious concerns. They should seriously trouble anyone, right? And I think it's okay. Well, we'll get that. Never mind. Okay, so so it takes a lot. It takes a lot of information, a lot of talking to go through the issues, right? Through these sorts of issues, which is why I think, especially for a conversation like this, kind of the bigger picture stuff is good. But again, I'll give a couple of sketches.
You want to rely on more of a meta level response, which maybe means that we don't need to go through every little sub point.
Exactly, yeah. Especially, particularly as you said, neither of us are historians, and some of these things really do come down to like specific historical data, right? Which is about which there's disagreement, right? So for a couple, kind of address a couple of these things in broad outline. So. So you mentioned first the Book of Abraham, right? So it's right that I think pretty it is uncontroversially right that the documents we have today, the papyri, don't say what Joseph Smith thought they said. So it's a little bit complicated. So the text of the Book of Abraham, as the Latter-day Saint canon, the Latter-day Saint canon includes, is not contained in these papyri, uncontroversially, right? So there are two kind of ways of responding to the Latter-day Saint apologist, as Dustin knows. We've had a conversation about this. He knows this. One is that there are missing portions of papyri, which we know were lost in a fire in a museum in Chicago. And so some people claim that, or some people, theorize that that's what contained the actual writings of Joseph Smith. And there are some problems with that view. I think that's a less plausible view, but there are still, there's an Egyptologist in the church who's respected in his field who holds that view. And the other view, which I think is more plausible, is the catalyst view. Joseph Smith thought what he was doing was translating what was written on these papyri, but in fact, they would just serve as a catalyst for revelation. And I actually think we have reason to expect this of the way that he translated. So it seems early on he had a pretty mechanical view of what was going on when he translated the Book of Mormon. But later, it's pretty clear that he doesn't think that revelations are kind of word-for-word dictations from God. So when he gets the revelations of the Doctrine of Covenants, which aren't translations, they're revelations generally to Joseph Smith, fewer from later prophets. It's clear that in the way he treats them, in kind of revising them and adding and openly, this isn't like, it's some secret thing he did, that he didn't think they were word for word. And I think it's a plausible, I think, if we think about the way revelation would work, and again, Christians have to think about this too. For those who think that the Bible is inspired, right? So there's some way that God communicates these words to people, right? And we have to. We don't have a lot of information, Latter-day Saints or Christians, about how that happens. But if we try to think about how that might work, I think it's plausible to think that it's not just a word-for-word transcription that God kind of like through automatic writing or anything like that. I think that's less plausible. We don't have to get into those issues, but so I think the catalyst view is a plausible, at least coherent account of why the Book of Abraham doesn't match up with what's on the papyri. So I think a lot of people who don't know a lot about Latter-day Saint responses to this think that the Book of Abraham case is just totally conclusive. And this gets into why
the catalyst view is the view that he looked at the papyri, but it actually there was like a different, that caused him to
receive revelation.
About like a different papyri.
Right. So presumably this is still a historical document that Abraham wrote, but there don't need to be extant autographs because Joseph Smith received it by revelation and maybe totally lost.
So you acknowledge though that that's not what he thought.
No. Right. He did not think that was the case. So this gets into kind of issues about translation, which we talked about a little bit. Like, is it appropriate to call that a translation if that's what happened, right? And as well, there's again a lot of issues here. This all gets into very broad, we've got to kind of focus the discussion somehow. But that's one way of responding on the Book of Abraham. For Book of Mormon stuff, I actually think that's similar. Like for the King James version, I think. A kind of similar view that Joseph Smith was involved in the creative process of what we have as the translation of the Book of Mormon. So it doesn't actually reflect like word for word or even like particularly closely semantically what would have been written in an original ancient document. And again, I think there are different reasons to think that's a plausible account of what's going on. The Kinderhook plates, that's a big one that comes up a lot, but I think actually is genuinely a non-issue. So Joseph Smith kind of So there's Dan Fogel disagrees about this, but I think there's good reason to think that the Greek alphabet, what's called the Gael, it's an acronym that Joseph Smith produces, the grammar and alphabet of the Egyptian language they produces. So there's a question basically: did Joseph Smith think that he was translating in a pretty ordinary sense, where he's looking at particular like semantic units and identifying what they are, and did he produce this alphabet as a way of kind of preliminary work to translating? Or did he try to reverse engineer and did he try to match up symbols with what he received by revelation and then try to get a look at the more kind of mundane way of translating? Right. So he was interested in language. He learned Hebrew later on in his life, right, in the 1840s. But it's clear, also obviously, no one contests that in translating the Book of Mormon, for instance, he didn't think that he was reading this ancient language and could understand the ancient language, right? So that's I think some people have the misconception, not a lot of people actually anymore. I think it's pretty clear that he was translating. He claimed to translate by the gift and power of God, right? He didn't think that he's reading this ordinarily. In fact, most of the time he wasn't even looking at the plates when he translated the Book of Mormon. So clearly, it's not anything like an ordinary translation. The question is how much like it is, right? So then, is there room to say that Joseph Smith was part of the greater process, that he was understanding these things through kind of a filter of his own worldview? I think that's plausible enough, and we can disagree about that, but and we can talk about that if you'd like. But these sorts of things, and then saying things like, oh well, when he identified passages that were quoted that are equivalent to passages in the King James version of the Bible, which he was familiar with, he may have just brought those versions in because that's what he knew, and it makes it clear that identifiable to his audience that he's kind of referring to the same scriptural tradition, right? So in a way, you can imagine why he might think that would authenticate the Book of Mormon, right? That oh look, this is Jesus saying the same things. And so, I certainly it's not, and again, we'll get into this when I talk about some methodological concerns. It's not logically incompatible, right? It's not logically contradictory to think that Joseph Smith would,
I agree with that.
Right, yeah, and that's such a low bar that doesn't say very much, right? But again, I think we'll get into the kind of those methodological concerns. And again, we can talk about things like Book of Mormon, civilization, right? So like again, I don't. It looks like actually, so Joseph Smith thought, and people in his time thought that the Book of Mormon peoples were the ancestors of all of the Native Americans, right? So they were all descended of the people who came over in the the story of the Book of Mormon. Now it actually looks like in the Book of Mormon, which I think is what we would expect. So let's say the position of most church apologists now is that actually the Book of Mormon peoples constituted just a fraction of the people who were there, right? So they came over and they joined this local population, and that would actually explain, if that's right, we wouldn't expect to see a genetic footprint necessarily, right? Because there's kind of various factors, right? So there's like genetic bottlenecking and things that we wouldn't necessarily, if they're a small part of the population, we wouldn't necessarily expect to see those genetic markers. And so again, something I think people would say is like a knockdown case against the Mormon position. And again, if you think that only Hebrews are ancestors of the current Native Americans, then that is, I think, a pretty clear-cut issue. But in the Book of Mormon itself, there are indications that they actually were part of a larger culture, a group of people, which we would expect. So the genetic stuff, and then on kind of evidence of this civilization, the state of North and South American archaeology is actually quite poor. So we've of the identified archaeological sites, we've excavated something like 0.5%. I mean, it's just tiny. And so if they only constitute a small part of the local population, I don't think we would expect to see particularly strong evidence of this civilization at this point, right? So and as well, anachronisms that were thought to be anachronisms in Joseph Smith's day, a lot of them are now known to not be the case. So like in terms of population sizes, in Joseph Smith's day, it was absurd to think that there was a large population in South America in the time frame that which he's talking about, but it's much larger than we initially thought. So, and there's all sorts of other things that were thought to be anachronisms that aren't, and there's still things that are considered anachronisms, right? But what we would expect is that as time goes on, more of this can be vindicated, and that absolutely has been the trend, actually. And again, and these are kind of very particular empirical issues, and my approach to these epistemological concerns is much broader. So that's why I'm not here to debate the historical issues, as Dustin knows, and as I hope is clear to the audience. But I want to give some indications of why certain things might not be as troubling as they first appear. Right? Treasure digging. So obviously, I don't think it's particularly wrong to think that someone can engage in nefarious acts prior to their being called of God. Right? Saul was in that position and became Paul. But I think that's not just the only issue with treasure digging. Right? The concern is that it makes him look like he was a con man.
and it running a very similar
right. So it would
yeah.
like right. So it would have implications for the way I guess it supports the interpretation of what Joseph Smith was doing when he claimed to be a religious leader, right? If that's right, that he was a con man. But yeah, I think there are lots of mitigating factors here, right? So like Joseph Smith, Josiah Stoll, who you mentioned, testified on his behalf. It's not just the treasure of the case, though. He says that Joseph Smith correctly described like the inside and outside of his outhouse or something. I forget exactly what the story is. Joseph Smith with Josiah Stoll, actually. So Josiah Stoll said, I think I've got this like Spanish silver on my land. I'd like people to come and dig it up. He had workers digging. They couldn't find anything. He heard about Joseph Smith's miraculous powers. He calls in Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith has this agreement where he'll just be paid a certain amount of what they find, a certain percentage of what they find. And after a while, they don't find anything. Joseph Smith is the one, according to the historical record, that convinces Josiah Stoll to stop. And then Josiah Stoll testifies on his behalf. And I think all these things can be mitigating factors. They can make it look like it's actually not as bad as it first appears when you describe, these problematic features in isolation. On the first vision, I think that, several of the features that have been identified as changes, I think, are not really good candidates for changes. Others probably are. So like you said, just talking about one figure as opposed to two looks like it's more troubling. I know I did a study of these a few years ago, and I don't remember all the details anymore of the changes. So obviously failing to mention something isn't necessarily problematic, right? It makes sense in different contexts to emphasize different elements, or across time to forget certain things, right? Like I actually don't think it's, when I think about like, so 38 as opposed to 1920 when he got the vision, 18 years, 32 is the first time.
The accounts are 6 years apart.
Right.
And they're both written down. It's not like he's speaking extemporaneously.
But right. But we don't know that, we don't, I think it's clear from the differences that are there that he's not referring to the 1832 account when he writes the 1838 account, right? So then the memory is, I guess back to 6 years to when he was thinking about it in that instance, then 18 years to when the vision actually happened. I know for me personally that, I'm young enough to where 18 years ago, I don't have a lot of memories, but even 6 years ago, I know that there's a lot that I would not be able to accurately convey. So you're right that there are certain things that I think we can't explain that way, right? So like two people are one person. But I think other elements, I think it's totally plausible to talk about.
Yeah, and I want to grant a lot of the differences are not important. But it seems like there are
some people make
really
much ado about some of that. I'm just like, I don't know about that. And then polygamy. And this is troubling for a lot of people who stay in the church, right? Something that bothers a lot of people who are active believing members. So there are things like, the 14-year-old that he married, there's no evidence that they had sexual relations. So Brian Hales, I think, gives a plausible account. He's a Latter-day Saint apologist and historian. I think he gives a plausible account of explaining a lot of these cases. So as you pointed out, some of these appear to have been not at all intended to be sexual relationships. Some of them were with very old women, or not very old women, women in their 50s, I think. Yeah. He didn't have children with any of these women, which, given the fact that many of them went on to marry again and have children, that sort of thing, would suggest that if he was in this for sexual gratification, we would expect to see children from this. We'd expect to see him marrying women within a certain range. We'd expect him to be having sexual relationships with all of them, and that's not supported by the historical record, right? It seems like, so he did have sexual relationships with some of them. Some people in the church deny that. I don't really know why we should deny that. Brigham Young, we know, did. He had children with lots of, right? So I don't think, the LDS position should be that it's in principle okay for polygamy, including sexual relationships, to take place, right? We can mention that he was married to a 14-year-old, but I think it's incomplete if we don't mention that we don't have any reason to think. In fact, we have reason to think he didn't have sexual relations with her, right? So that all bears on the issue. And so then the question is, is it conceivable that God would ask someone to have sexual relationships with more than one woman, to be a polygamous relationships? And I think it is plausible to think that. I think the Old Testament seems to suggest that God endorses that, although that's somewhat controversial. And then other, beyond that, as we'll get into the more methodological issues, I'm okay to say that these can lower the credence of our credence in the LDS truth claims, because I think I have sufficient outweighing evidence to accept truth claims of the church even in the face of these issues. And that's my general approach. That's what I want to talk about a little bit more generally. I don't know if you want to talk about anything I said there, and then we can maybe move on. But I don't mind if you have.
I think I have a few things to say. I mean,
sure.
Yeah, so I agree that none of this. I mean, just trivially, none of this renders Mormonism like logically incoherent or something, right? Mm-hmm. Of course, and as you know, that's not that's a very low bar, because all sorts of things are, you don't have any arguments that make them logically impossible, but they're still really, really improbable, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think with polygamy, I think, first of all, even the chaste relationships seem pretty messed up. If somebody comes to my 14-year-old daughter and tells her, you have to agree to be married to me in the afterlife, and if you do it, the whole family will gain eternal salvation, and you have 24 hours to decide. I'm not going to be like, oh, well, it's only in the, that still seems pretty disturbing to me. And I didn't even mean to be relying on the fact of polygamy as such so much as on the way that it was practiced. Maybe God could tell somebody to be polygamous in some sort of, imagine there's like an island with one man and 10 women and humanity will go extinct, whatever. But the particular way that he went about it seems to me to be very disturbing. And he lied about doing it, and we know that he lied about doing it. The first vision, as I say, many of the inconsistencies that people point to, I'm not worried about. But there are big inconsistencies that really affect the significance of it, that seem to come along in ways that are convenient for Joseph. The treasure digging. The fact that people thought that he could really see stuff. I think that he was scamming them, though. How did he convince Josiah Stoll about I have no idea, right? But they never found any treasure, so he wasn't really seeing treasure, right? So, I don't know. And this is something Dan Vogel talks about. When people describe something that a magician does, it's often hard to figure out what the magician really did, because they're layering. If they were fooled, they're layering their own interpretation of the events. So I don't know what was happening there, but I don't think it was something really supernatural. I think he was tricking people. With regard to the Book of Abraham, so I guess we're in agreement that he didn't do what he thought that he was doing, and this catalyst theory is sort of an attempt to save the view in light of this evidence. Then it's evidence against the view. I take it, and maybe that's all there is to say. The Book of Mormon. I actually don't know what these passages that talk about there being other people. So for the benefit of people who don't know, I guess Mormons used to think that the Lamanites were the ancestors of all Native Americans, and now we know that's not true. So now Mormon people who are talking about this stuff say, well, maybe they were just confined to like a very small area in South America or something like that. They didn't really interact with other people very much, and they ultimately kind of got wiped out. And I guess it seems like if that was true, over the course of thousands of years, you would expect like the Mayans to show up in the Book of Mormon or something like that, or at least I would. And similarly, the title page of the Book of Mormon, which is supposed to be part of the plates. He claims that it was part of the plates. Says that it's written for the Lamanites. I guess like prophetically, he knows that the Lamanites are going to, and this makes sense if Joseph Smith thinks he's going to convert the Native Americans. It doesn't make sense if the Lamanites no longer exist because they got assimilated by the Mayans and left no trace, it seems to me that there are just, there's a lot of evidence. And again, just the fact that we haven't found anything, it's possible that they would exist and we wouldn't have found anything, but it's also possible that we would have. Although I'll
remind you about what I said about archaeology. So I think it's wrong to say, I want to know if there are oak trees in this forest. It's a forest of 10,000 trees. I've looked at 10, and I would expect to have found something. Right? That's false. Right? I think we wouldn't have expected to find something. As I said, something like 0.5% of the sites in South America, North America, have been excavated. So I think we wouldn't actually expect to have found anything.
Yeah, sure. Well,
as in like direct confirmation of particular stories,
maybe we just have different intuitive judgments about how weird it is. It's true.
Statistically, right? Like we wouldn't expect to have seen specific evidence of something that was fairly confined geographically given the fact that we've only got 0.5% of the areas excavated, right? That just
it depends on how confined they were, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
But it also, I mean, regarding the translation stuff. So if it's a loose translation, that solves a lot of the problems, right? With apparent plagiarism and stuff like this. It doesn't solve some of the big apparent like conceptual plagiarism. You know, the fact that it seems like something the overall historical backbone seems like something that he might have made up.
You mean the
fact that these ideas
of Hebrews in America sort of thing? Yeah. Well, I mean, sometimes I think those similarities are overstated. I think actually the view of the Hebrews comparisons are actually pretty lame. So like if you read,
I'm not suggesting that he necessarily copied that exact book.
Right. Okay.
Views like this generally were.
Sure.
And
I have to laugh sometimes at some of the like the CES letter, which is kind of a famous anti-Mormon document.
Some of the supposed plagiarism.
Right. Like it says like the fact that there are rivers moving in a certain direction. It's just kind of like it's so silly. Like. And whatever, gish galloping is a thing, but no, and there, I think it should be something that we take seriously to say, oh, well, this was an idea that was in the culture, right? To say that the 10 tribes, the lost 10 tribes, are actually the ancestors of Native Americans. But again, there are differences, right? So it's not the 10 tribes in Joseph Smith's account; it's the Hebrews, or the Jews, right, who come over and are the explanation.
Well, they're still Israelites.
Sure, but it's not the and it's and you can give all sorts of God's providence. He's preparing people for this. By acting in history or and it's just I think it's even if it were true that the Hebrews came over, we would just as well in that world. So let's imagine stipulate that that's the case, that the Book of Mormon narrative is roughly correct. It's just true that we would still expect people to Europeans who've come and settled the Americas to make this to give this theory because it makes sense of the world from a perspective that they occupy, right? So I think we would expect that to be in the air either way.
It's not that provides evidence against the Hebrews coming over. It's that provides evidence for
Joseph for him Smith making it up, right? But again, I think it's not only in this case. It's not only consistent with Joseph Smith not having made it up. It's also what we would expect to be the case if he were telling the truth, right? So like it's one of those cases where I think it's not a particularly strong example of like. So I think better instances are like the fact that infant baptism is mentioned in the Book of Mormon, right, which is something that was very much in the air at the time. But was.
Oh yeah, sure. The reason I want to focus on that, the example of the view of the Hebrews-esque cultural whatever, is because you can say. Well, the stuff about infant baptism and whatever, Joseph Smith was really translating plates, but he kind of threw that stuff in, his own blah, blah, blah.
Oh, I see. So you're saying the whole premise.
But you can't say he threw in the stuff about this civilization existing. I see. Then there would have been no plates at all, right?
Right.
So that's why I want to focus on that.
Okay, I understand.
Yeah. I also, the reason that people have this mechanical view of translation, I think, all of the witnesses to him transcribing it thought that what happened was he looked at the stone and he literally could see English words.
For part of the process. That was right. Early on. He didn't actually. That's not the process that happened later in the translation of the Book of Mormon. I don't know if you know that. So he did. So he engaged in different kinds of different. So early on, he used I think just two different. What you might call catalysts. So he had a what's called the Urim and Thummim, which is mentioned in the Bible, like a pair of spectacles, let him translate. And then it seems like early on he also largely relied on the seer stone with the hat to block out light. But then later on he didn't use anything. He would just transcribe without using any sort of mechanism, if you want to call it that. And so the view of Latter-day Saints, and even at the time, was, well, he needed something kind of to spur creativity, to open up kind of the channels, to open his receptivity, because he was unpracticed at this, which I think mentally makes sense. I think it can, if you try to think about how difficult it would be to sort out receiving thoughts from an outside source from your own thoughts, right? Which I think Christians who believe in kind of witness of the Spirit already have had to grapple with. It makes sense that you would need some sort of more tangible way of approaching this if you're unpracticed that, and then that would gradually go away. That's a coherent account, I think. And so later on it certainly wasn't mechanical because he wasn't looking at the stone, right? Or not certainly wasn't mechanical. It wasn't mechanical in the same way, or we don't have that.
It wasn't mechanical in the same way. But he didn't give any indication that he was not that he was now adding his own stuff or anything.
No, and I don't think he thought.
And he didn't know
that it was all super filtered through his worldview, that he's in the expansion view. I don't think he would have understood it that way, right? Yeah, I think he thought it was a translation in a fairly conventional. It's obviously not that conventional because it's still coming from God either way. He can't read the language.
So what do you make of the story about the angel and the manuscript pages? Because the
Martin Harris story.
Yeah, because that story, specifically as related to this loose translation view.
Right.
Because it seems like the premise of that story is sort of that if there are any differences, he's going to be discredited, right?
Yeah, and I think that's.
But if the angel it goes along with that, the angel must think that that's how the translation works too, right?
Well, not necessarily, because the angel could just be kind of pointing out that it would be something that would discredit if it came out differently, right? So even if it's true that it would have come out differently. So let's say we don't accept the mechanical view and think that Joseph Smith is a creative part of the process. Okay, so one thing I'll say, Brigham Young said, if Joseph Smith received his revelations today, or actually maybe specifically about the Book of Mormon, he said it would have been written differently. So even as early as Brigham Young, the second prophet, right, he said it's not this mechanical process. Joseph F. Smith says a similar thing. Joseph Smith's nephew, who was later a president of the church as well. So yeah, this view that there wasn't a mechanical process was early, right? It's not some modern invention to try to save the view. Yeah, and so I think the angel could be saying, "Hey, this will discredit you if it happens." And I don't actually know a lot. I don't think I've ever really read much about the Martin Harris case, about how plausible it is that there were people trying to discredit him with this ploy. I know Martin Harris's wife was not keen on Joseph Smith at all. She was very adversarial about the whole thing.
She's probably the one who took the pages.
Yeah, right. I think that seems to be the consensus, right? And so then, like, whether she would collude with somebody, actually, I have no idea. I think, as you say, there are problems with that view in terms of like how likely is it that they could reproduce a manuscript with the same handwriting, that sort of thing. But I don't know if that's the view. Maybe I think part of it. I thought the suggestion was that they would be like publishing, like as in like with a printing press, this altered version, and saying, "Look, this is different," which I think would be enough for plenty of people to reject that he was translating ancient documents.
Well, if they were going to do that, then they could just publish whatever they wanted, presumably, right?
Well, I think you'd want it to be close enough as to where it looks like he's making up extemporaneously speaking, but you could change, right? You
could change details that are in the version that is in the Book of Mormon too, couldn't you?
But it's not just like a retelling of the same stories. There's different material covered in the two books, and so you'd want it to be close enough, I imagine, to what Joseph actually publishes. Maybe publish it right before and says, "Look, there's differences, but it's clearly the same thing he's trying to get at," right? Whereas it's the plates of Lehi that were 116 pages. I don't think would match even nearly closely enough what Joseph Smith ends up translating as the beginning of the Book of Mormon for that to have been like a particularly, because like obviously if I just like right now publish a document that's supposed to be a pretty different version of Genesis and say, "Oh, I have access to an old version of Genesis and look how different this is," it wouldn't say very much, right? Without the 116 pages, they could do this, but it wouldn't be very believable. So to make it more believable, I don't know. I'm speculating.
Well, Joseph Smith did do that too.
What do you mean? Oh, well, yeah, he does the translation of Genesis, yeah.
But
I don't actually know much about that case, like how likely it is that Martin Harris's wife would engage in something like that. But yeah, I don't accept mechanical translation anyway, so I would have expected it to come out differently. It's just not a case that particular instance is not one that particularly lowers the credence level for me.
It seems odd that it seems odd that the story is premised on the mechanical translation view, including the angel's involvement.
But again, I think it could be pretty utilitarian, right? I think it's probably true that if he produced something different, even if that's the way it works, that it would have been something to discredit, especially early on in the church, before it's really established. The church hadn't been founded until after the Book of Mormon was published, right?
It also just seems suspicious that this is what happened.
Sure, yeah. And again, that can lower the credence level. For me, as I say, with my epistemology, it just doesn't bother me that much. I understand that it will be bothersome to some people, but maybe if you're okay with it, maybe we can move on to some kind of bigger. This has gone further. That's fine, but yeah.
What would you say to somebody, like, for example, that is part of the LDS church, and basically here's what you're saying, and they say, okay, maybe this doesn't affect them as much, his beliefs and stuff like that, his faith, but it does to me. So how do you help me? To prevent me from either leaving the faith or explain this to me in a way that I don't have to walk away.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think actually an excellent segue into the kind of methodological stuff. Yeah, so I think often people approach religion with this kind of presupposition of some kind of evidentialism, right? And it's very popular in apologetics today, particularly in Christian apologetics, like standard Christian apologetics, right? The idea is that you would give some sort of argument for theism, a cosmological argument, ontological argument, or whatever. And once you've established theism, you give maybe a historical case for Christ. That gets you to Christianity, right? So like the way that you ought to come to believe in Christianity is through argumentation like this. That's kind of a standard view, right? And I think once you commit to that, it opens you up to refutation by evidence, right? I think it's much easier to think. So like you could give a syllogism like this, right? The Exodus didn't happen anything like it's described in the Bible. If premise one, right, the Exodus didn't have anything like it's described in the Bible, then Christianity is false, therefore Christianity is false, right? So that's a deductive argument. That's probably not the best way to go about it. You want to do inductive or abductive, but for simplicity's sake, we'll do deductive form, right? And so, how would you respond to that? So I think the standard go-to response for most people would be to say, well, actually, I want to disagree on historical grounds, right? Like maybe the evidence is underdetermining, or we have reason to think it did happen that way, right? Or maybe you want to challenge the naturalistic assumptions of the scholars who say the Exodus didn't happen, right? And so that would be attacking premise one, right? You'd want to challenge the assumption that, or the premise that the Exodus didn't happen as the Bible describes, right? I think that's an important part of the way we approach religion, but I think it ought not to be the way we settle religious questions. So there are reasons to think that that's the case, right? I mean, so like, history is probabilistic on several levels, right? So we'll have conflicting accounts. We don't have all the information we might want, right? Stuff goes missing. You have to interpret it, and then it becomes much, much harder to do history, I think, in an epistemically justified way once we try to make claims about like people's psychology, right? Like this person was being duplicitous. I mean, so like you can have outward instances where we have a record of what they said, and then it's contradicted. But like if we try to say that this person was I don't know, like disposed to be a liar or super libidinous. We can look at outward indications, but the mental life of a person is not something we can access even today. Right? I can't access the mental life of anyone besides myself. So it becomes tricky, and that's not to say that we can't come to historical conclusions. History generally is a epistemically reliable practice, but I think in religion, that's one of the reasons why it's not super compelling to think that on historical grounds we should decide these sorts of questions. I think the better reason to think that's not what we should decide it is there are different ways of approaching these questions. So as I said, that would be attacking premise one, right? So we have a historical claim like Joseph Smith was a sexual predator. Say that's premise one. Premise two, if premise one, then the Mormon Church is false. Conclusion, Mormon Church is false, right? So you could attack premise one and say, I think historically it's not true to say that, right? You could attack premise two and you could say, actually, those are not incompatible, right? So I think the stronger you make premise one, the harder it is to do this to premise two. So if you said Joseph Smith was the most evil man alive, that's a hard premise one to defend, but it would make premise two nearly impossible to attack. Anyone looking at this would be hard pressed to say, no, the Mormon Church could be true and its founder could be the most evil man alive, right? That would be really difficult to defend. So the strengths are this kind of a give and take, but I think in other cases it's very plausible to this, right? So you could say, as a Christian, I think that it's maybe true that the Exodus didn't happen in the way the Bible describes, but that doesn't falsify Christianity, right? So then I think that's a very plausible approach to lots of these kinds of questions, right? Maybe the Book of Abraham isn't what was on these papyri, but that's not incompatible with the LDS position. In fact, I think you could go so far as to say things like, and this is, I think, a better reason for why historical cases are not super great in religious questions. If the Book of Abraham was a fraud, or it was not historical at all, the Book of Mormon wasn't historical at all, then the Mormon Church is false. Well, someone can deny the premise too there by saying the Book of Mormon is inspired fiction, which some Latter-day Saints do. So I think that's less plausible, right? In that sort of case. In other cases, I don't think it's implausible, right? To say that Joseph Smith was a flawed person, for instance, very plausible to deny premise two, right? It makes sense to say that he's flawed and the LDS Church could be true. But on the Book of Mormon case, I think it's implausible to say the Book of Mormon wasn't historical. But some people do that. They would challenge the premise two there. And then finally, I think the other way to approach these questions is a sort of modus tollens, right? So modus ponens is if A, then B, A, therefore B. Modus tollens is if A, then B, not B, therefore not A, right? So you deny the conclusion, and therefore you know that somewhere in the premises something's going wrong, right? So for instance, you have some argument, Joseph Smith was a sexual predator. If he was a sexual predator, the Mormon Church is false, therefore the Mormon Church is false. How do you challenge this in modus tollens way? You'd say, well, actually, I know on independent grounds that the Mormon Church is true, and therefore I know something has gone wrong. Either premise one is false, or premise two is false, or both. But I don't have to be able to specify that, right, in order for this to work. And I think we know that this is a generally a good way of reasoning, right? So like if you think about conspiracy theories, if someone says to you something like, I don't know, like Bush to 9/11 conspiracy, right? So like the World Trade Center tower fell at free fall speeds, which is not possible if it was collapsing from the impact of the plane. That means there has to have been charges in the building or whatever the claim is, right? I don't have the physics knowledge to explain why that's not a good argument, but I have independent reasons to think it's not true that George Bush was behind 9/11, and therefore I have reason to reject the argument, even though I can't specify why it's false, right? So I think we accept this reasoning. In science, we do it too. The Galileo, right? He was challenged on his theory. People would say things like, well, if the Earth is spinning, why don't we fly off the Earth? And he didn't have an answer. He didn't have a way of addressing that particular problem. But I think he was justified enough in his conclusion based on his astronomical observations as to where he was justified in spite of what appeared to be evidence against his position, right? So yeah, this modus tollens approach, I think, is we recognize, at least in some case, in principle, that this is good reasoning, right? So what would this look like in the defense of the Latter-day Saint Church? And so first of all, I do want to point out, I think there are good reasons to think this is just, well, yeah. So I think another reason to think we shouldn't rely on these historical cases a bunch is there's a tendency to kind of over-intellectualize things in modern apologetics that I think is a bit insidious. So if you think about, so like, for one, so like you and I, Dustin, we are very privileged to be able to devote a lot of time to studying things, right? Resources and the time to be able to do that. Most Christians in the world don't have the luxury of doing that, right? So the overwhelming majority of the Christians in the world couldn't respond to objections about the history of the Bible. But I don't want to say that they're not rational in being Christians on those grounds. So I think there's a danger when you go the evidentialist route of excluding people that we should probably say are rational in their belief, right? Or if you say that arguments for the existence of God should be the basis for rational belief in God. I think a lot of people are not equipped to understand the ontological argument, right? And that's okay. I think they can be rational Christians despite that. Right? So that's another reason I think we shouldn't necessarily, and then on the historical questions, like, it's just about research and that sort of thing, and be able to arbitrate these historical disputes. I don't want to exclude Latter-day Saints and Christians who aren't immersed in this from being rational believers. And so I think this sort of modus tollens argument can be a way of accommodating that. So sometimes I think you can have a modus tollens on intellectual grounds, right? So you could say, let's see, so that maybe you could break it down to two ways of thinking about it. We could reject the conclusion that, let's say, the conclusion being the Mormon Church is false, either by having independent support for the position that the Mormon Church is true, or independent reasons to think that other positions are false, right? So this could be historical, like maybe the production of the Book of Mormon is so miraculous, the time period, its internal complexity and consistency, that sort of thing, that I can't explain that, and that's evidence in favor of the Latter-day Saint view, right? You can have philosophical arguments in favor of the view or against other views. So like, I don't think classical theism is, I think there are a lot of problems with classical theism. And so that would count as evidence towards ruling out alternatives, right? And so that could help build a modus tollens case of the kind I've been describing. And then you could have cumulative cases, right, where you put stuff together and you say, on the basis of all sorts of different evidence for and against positions, I come to the conclusion the Mormon Church must be true, and therefore I can respond with the modus tollens to these objections. And then what I think is most compelling is basing this on religious experience. And so we can talk about this. I think this is the kind of some of what we wanted to get into, Dustin. But I think on the basis of having had a religious experience that confirms particular propositions or approaches or religions, I don't want to get too bogged down in specifics on that. I think you can be justified in accepting that a particular church is true. So let's say I've had a religious experience. I therefore think the Mormon Church is true. And therefore, I don't need to worry as much about these ancillary historical questions. I have enough justification to accept a particular position that these other questions are outweighed by the kind of epistemic weight of the religious experience. So I think, again, in principle, it should be clear that this is possible, right? So like, if you imagine that you are Joseph Smith, and it actually happens to be the case, Jesus and God come down to you and they say, hey, all the other churches are false, I want you to found a church. I think most people would agree. If that happened to you, you would be epistemically justified in accepting that position, right? In accepting what was said to you by God himself, right? And then you can think about someone like Martin Harris. He's not the one founding the church, so should he believe Joseph Smith is an actual prophet or not? Well, he had an angel come down to him. He held the plates and that sort of thing, right? So on the basis of those experiences, it seems like Martin Harris, that was Oliver Cowdery. I think I said Martin Harris. Oliver Cowdery would be justified in accepting this particular position, right? I think generally people would agree with that. And so obviously that's not enough for other people. We're talking now about kind of individual justification. It's not an argument. You can't convince someone else on the basis of your religious experience. But I think it can be in principle, the grounds for rational belief in God. And that's not something that requires particular cognitive capacities or research capacities or anything like that. So it doesn't fall prey to many of the, I think, the problems that plague evidentialist accounts. So maybe I'll stop there. I think, so basically my approach is to say, I think on the basis of religious experience and kind of personal experiences that I can conclude rationally that the LDS Church is true, that the truth claims of the Church are true, generally speaking. And therefore, I can run a modus tollens argument and know that something's going wrong if we make a syllogistic argument as to why the Mormon Church is false, even if I can't, in every case, specify why. But then, of course, we all have worldviews. It's not we don't act on particular single principles like this. I also have reasons to attack premise 1 or premise 2 in other cases, right? And this kind of general cumulative case, my philosophical reasons for thinking the LDS Church is true or other positions are false. It all comes together, but I think the core of it, and this is the LDS position, Moroni 10:5, right? By the power of the Holy Ghost, you shall know the truth of all things. We're encouraged in the church to pray about whether the Book of Mormon is true, for instance, and receive confirmation from God himself, right? Or that's how evangelism works. Missionaries go to people and say, hey, receive a personal witness, have a religious experience that confirms it, right? So that's the kind of, I would say, the quasi-official epistemology of the church. So that's my approach. I would run this modus tollens primarily on the basis of this religious experience. So Dustin, I don't know if you want to kind of dive into some particular issues here, but that's my approach to epistemology, and that's why I'm not as bothered by these historical questions, which I think are less epistemically weighty, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I think I agree. I mean, I agree in principle with quite a lot of what you've said. So I mean, I agree that certainly you can have evidence against a proposition, and then you have you're not sure what's wrong with that evidence, but you have stronger evidence for it, and so you figure, well, something's wrong with this. Yeah, of course that's true. I agree that religious experience confers some sort of prima facie justification. It's going to come down to the question of whether in any given case, like the justification provided by the religious experience outweighs the justification provided by empirical or philosophical or whatever evidence against it. Yeah. I guess, I mean, maybe sort of a meta level. I mean, I don't want to get too bogged down into like very high level epistemological questions.
Sure.
Right? But I guess it sort of seems to me like, so religious experience is a source of prima facie justification. We do also know that people in all religious traditions have experiences that they take to confirm their own traditions. We know that people, I'm sure you would agree, people within the LDS Church have misleading religious experiences.
Yeah.
There have been times
or allegedly religious experiences would maybe say.
They take themselves to have had experiences that confirm, and there have been long periods where the church taught very harmful things, and no one figured out that was, or no one in the leadership figured out that was wrong. And, my fiance is Black. Brigham Young thinks I should be put to death for that, right? So like that's not very good. So it looks like, either in all these cases we have to say either when people are having, and he taught all sorts of others, as you know. It looks like when people have it looks like we know either people are susceptible to having like non-veridical religious experiences, or we know that people are susceptible to misinterpreting their religious experiences, or maybe reading too much into them, filtering them through their own prior beliefs, whatever, right? And that makes me think, they do confer prima facie justification, but when you're talking about religious experiences that are supposed to confirm, highly specific sectarian claims. If an angel came down and said, Dustin, you need to join the Southern Baptist Convention. And by the way, here are the prime factors of this really huge number that your subconscious couldn't possibly produce. And I write them down and they really, that would be one thing. But generally speaking, when it comes to religious experience confirming, highly specific sectarian claims, it seems to me we ought to be a little skeptical about that, because we know that people are in general are susceptible to, including people in our own religious traditions, are susceptible to being mistaken about that. And so we should try to calibrate it against the other sources of evidence that we have that might be less susceptible to wishful thinking or misinterpretation or whatever. And it seems to me that that is where the pro Joseph Smith side sort of flounders.
Sure.
So that's kind of a very high level sort of thought. But.
Yeah. So as you say, I think one thing that someone who's claiming to have radical religious experiences that affirm particular propositions can do is to say, yeah, I think huge swathes of people are simply mistaken. They're not having radical religious experience, or as you say, that they're reading stuff into it, right, or misinterpreting something in some way. And I think the Latter-day Saint tradition has some plausible ways of gesturing at that. I think it's not all that needs to be said, but so like for instance, I think there's a sense in which we're quite ecumenical. We're pretty open with our conditions for salvation, right? So we have vicarious ordinances. People in the next life can be saved. So it's not like super essential that people in this life necessarily hear about Mormonism and become Mormons themselves, right? So I think to say that God is leading someone in Saudi Arabia to Islam and to a closer relationship with the Abrahamic God is not implausible on Latter-day Saint view. I think we can very easily say that. And then I think there are particular cases, like when people go to like certain kinds of church events with really heightened emotion and that sort of thing, and they claim religious experience in those sort of settings, well, we can identify features that make it seem less plausible that those are veridical religious experiences. So there's all sorts of things you can do there. And I don't think it's necessary to get into the details, because my interest, I'm not particularly interested in. I'm not really interested, hardly at all, in talking to other people and trying to convince them on rational grounds to become Latter-day Saints. I'm interested in getting them to try to find out for themselves on the basis of religious experience, and also in justifying to others that the religious experiences that Latter-day Saints have can be justifying, right? So kind of a negative case for why there's room for rational belief here. And so I think if it's okay, I'll run a thought experiment, kind of an analogy by you, and we can talk about some of the details if you'd like about whether they may or may not apply. I think in the kind of the relevant ways, it mirrors or models religious experience as I've experienced it. So basically, we imagine that psychics are real. So there are people who can put thoughts in your head, right? And we know that's the case, right? So let's say there's a study being done. 10 people are brought into a room. They're asked to sit in silence for an unspecified length of time. There's a psychic in another room, and they're told this psychic is going to try to impress a thought on one particular individual here, only one person here. And after an unspecified amount of time, again, we'll bring you all back and say, which one of you thinks you received a thought from the psychic, right? So some time passes, and they're all brought back, and they're asked who thinks they received it. And actually, everyone there, if we want to account for atheists, maybe we'll say 9 people say that they received the thought. One person says they don't, whatever. They're asked what was the thought. So one person says, "Oh, it was a number, a particular number." I was told. Another person says it was a sentence like "Today is Tuesday." Another person was told, or believes they were told, go home and read Faulkner, right? People are making these claims about what was said. One person received the impression. So there's an analog clock on the wall in this room. They received the thought, or it feels phenomenologically they feel that they received this thought when the clock says 6:05, 30 seconds past 6:05, they'll call for an end to the study, right? So this is as they're sitting in there, he thinks he receives this thought. Sure enough, 6:05 and 30 seconds, they call an end to it. It seems to me at that moment, that person is justified in saying they were the person to receive the thought from the psychic, even though everyone else also makes that same claim. And if you don't think that's enough, we could say they go back and they say, we're going to do it again. Maybe the same person receives the thought, maybe they don't. Same 10 people go and sit in there, and the exact same thing happens. This person again receives an exact time as to when the study is going to end, and it's surely enough, exactly at that time they call into the study. So now this person had like kind of confirmation that the experience was veridical, that's external to the experience itself. So maybe religious experience has some intrinsic feature that makes it kind of self-justificatory in some way, right? Or like a prima facie justified, maybe. But I think it's enough to kind of make the space for belief on the basis of religious experience. If we say maybe they have these sorts of kind of ancillary confirming experiences that gives you particular information you couldn't have had, or and you alluded to this, right? When you said, it gives you this numbers and it gives you the factorials, right? So I think that is part of the way I've experienced religious experience, right? Where I've had particular propositions that I wouldn't have known otherwise, and that you can attribute to chance. But when it happens repeatedly through your life, or you have all these sorts of, various kinds of personal experiences that seem to be confirming something, that eventually it can be justificatory, and that then the experience later on, independent of further, independently justificatory, independent confirmations, you can, become used to the phenomenology of the experience, and it can be justificatory in its own right? Like our vision, we don't have to keep confirming that we're seeing things accurately in order to rely on it, because we've confirmed that kind of in the past. We now can rely on it just at its face. So that's kind of the way I see it. I think if an individual genuinely has experienced these sorts of things that have kind of confirming experiences surrounding it, that individual should be justified, or can be justified, in accepting it. And I think that may be even possible for conflicting claims, but maybe it's just a fact of the matter that hasn't happened. So that's my. I don't know if you want to talk about details of the analogy or kind of the broader concerns there.
Yeah.
Before you respond, Dustin, let's try to do like another 10 to 15 minutes so we can give the audience some time to ask some questions to you guys.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no problem.
Yeah, so I guess one thing I might have to ask you about the analogy again, because I was hung up on something you said before.
Okay.
Okay. The thing you said before was, okay, so the person in Saudi Arabia who has a religious experience and they're Muslim, and maybe God is leading them to God in the context of the Muslim tradition, and that. Okay, I mean that's okay. I'm fine with that for present purposes. Yeah. I mean I'm fairly ecumenical. Okay. But we do have to say this person, if they take it to confirm Islam specifically,
right,
and actually Mormonism is true or Catholicism is true, whatever, then they're mistaken about that.
Yes. Sorry, I should have clarified. You're right. So what can the Latter-day Saints say? They can say maybe that God, gave them a general impression to come to God, and they interpreted that as Islam is true, and they were wrong about that, or maybe God said it's okay for you to, it's good for you to become Muslim, but he didn't say the truth claims of Islam are true, or something. I don't know. I don't think we want to get into mechanics of revelation. Is there like this propositional content contained in revelation, right? But so I think you're right that it probably shouldn't. It's not right to say that God would tell this person Islam is true and actually be a veridical experience if it turns out Mormonism is true. I agree with that.
So it's a little, I guess, the more ecumenical we are about the experiences being real, real contact with the divine, I feel like the less confident we should be about them confirming any specific tradition.
Sure.
Because we're saying, okay, there are lots of real experiences that people mistakenly take to be confirming their traditions, but that's because they're kind of filtering it through their own.
Yes, that's right. But I would say I don't. I mean, I think it's definitely true that there are people who aren't LDS who have had religious experiences that led them to certain religious traditions. I'm happy to say it's plausible enough to me that huge amounts of purported religious experiences, confirming particular propositions or not, are not veridical. That seems plausible enough to me from where I'm sitting.
Yeah, right. Okay. And then the more that we say are not veridical, assuming that, maybe somebody lies or something.
Yeah, right.
Some televangelist who wants to make money. But insofar as we think they're not veridical, but the people are like honestly mistaken, then we have the question of whether, what if I'm honestly mistaken?
Yeah, right. And that's why I think the kind of particular propositions, the clock analogy are what I want to focus on.
I think it's going to depend on, it's just going to have to depend on the details, I guess. If everyone, suppose I knew that everyone was told you'll have the thought at such and such time, and everybody did because of the power of suggestion or whatever.
Yeah.
Or I don't know, maybe they can't see the clock, so that couldn't be it. But, if I knew that, then I would think, well, okay, maybe I shouldn't be so confident that it was me.
Sure.
These sorts of little coincidental things, insofar as I know that, maybe that's evidence for something. Mm-hmm. I guess I sort of think, insofar as I know that people, in lots of different circumstances have these little coincidental things, I might think, okay, that is some sort of genuinely providential thing, but what makes me so sure that this confirms Joseph Smith's claims as opposed to anything else? And I'm not even saying that you don't have some level of prima facie justification. I'm just saying I think the level is comparatively low. And so if there's significant outweighing evidence, then you might have to say, well, I guess I've misinterpreted.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, maybe we've kind of reached as much as needs to be said on it. So, like, I think I largely agree. Like, if one person had like twice in their life, they had kind of vaguely suggestive experiences, right, that could be interpreted different ways, or it could have been chance, right? And there's all this overwhelming stuff. Yeah, maybe not super rational for them to believe. I don't know. I'm not clear. I mean, again, I do actually. It's a genuine worry of mine to exclude large populations of Christians, Latter-day Saints, from having rational belief on the basis that they don't meet certain criteria that I set out. Because I don't think that's quite for me to. I mean, obviously, I'm going to do my best to judge as that I can, but I don't know. My presumption is that God thinks it's okay for lots of people to be Christian, even if they don't have super explicit rational reasons for being Christian, right? My presumption is that's true.
And I'm not denying that those people have.
Yeah, right. I know you're not. Yeah. But it definitely becomes different once you're in the position that you or I are in an affluent country where we study these things. Once you're exposed to the evidence and you have the resources to grapple with them, the levels for justification differ. Right? It's not the same as a medieval peasant who believes that the Catholic Church is true, right? So once we're in this kind of position of having a higher bar, again, maybe we've just kind of said what we said. In particular cases, I think we agree an individual could be justified. And I happen to think that in my case, I have had the sorts of experiences that do outweigh. But it's not something that I can argue for to convince someone else. It's just not the case. And so, I don't know. I get the sense that we're pretty much on the same page.
Yeah. So maybe we can go to the Q&A, I guess.
Yeah. I'm happy to take questions now if you are.
All right. So we have a few questions from the audience. We have this one right here from Eric. And this one is for you, Joseph. Let's see. He says, ask LDSP if he finds Royal Scotson's theory that Joseph Smith translated an already existing Book of Mormon to a more 1500s English, and how that affects the Golden Plates story.
Yeah, so I don't know a ton about Skousen's view. Basically, this guy has done a bunch of textual studies in the Book of Mormon and concluded that actually the language is not 19th century. It more closely matches early modern English, which is interesting. I don't know, that's just kind of an interesting, if you're a naturalist who doesn't think the Book of Mormon is supernatural, that's a super interesting kind of weird fact. And if you're a Latter-day Saint, so like Skousen's view is something like, there was like already a translation of it done into 15th century English, 16th century English. And then Joseph Smith is like, by revelatory processes, getting access to it. And I mean, it seems ad hoc in the sense that like, why would God do that? But at the same time, it's weird that the language is 300 years earlier than Joseph Smith's language. I'm not familiar with like how skeptics respond. Like if they say there's something about like Joseph Smith really, really imitating KJV language or something. Skousen's a smart guy. I have to think that I don't know enough about the view to see why he finds it super compelling. Maybe the linguistic evidence is like really strong. But to me, I don't feel a need to go that route. But it's not like an issue that bothers me a whole lot. But again, I don't know enough about the view probably to be like really intelligently talking about it, if that makes sense. I think you're muted.
Oh yeah, I can't hear you.
Okay.
Nice. Okay, so here's another question from Islam Maran. She's asking for you, Joseph, again. What happens to Orthodox Christians, non-Mormons, after death? And I think that's something that you talked about a little bit. So give us your thoughts. And then Dustin, if you have any thoughts about it, you can go ahead and give them as well.
Yeah, it's a good question. So, there's kind of the general problem in Christianity, like what happens to the people who've never heard about Jesus and die, right? So if you think about, before Christianity was established, the people living in China, right? Or even today, people living in North Korea and China and parts of the Middle East and all these things will never hear about Jesus. And it's even more pronounced in the case of Mormonism, which is a much smaller religion. If you count kind of Christianity as a whole as one big religion, especially because Protestants don't have super strict conditions on which church you're in, right? But the Latter-day Saint view is that there are particular ordinances you have to have in order to be saved, right? Like baptism, right? But in the LDS church, you have to be baptized in the LDS church to be saved. So that is, it seems like, well, the overwhelming majority of people in history and even today aren't hearing about it, how can they be saved? They don't have the opportunity. So actually, the way that Latter-day Saints deal with this, which I think is actually quite a nice reconciliation of justice, is that there are vicarious ordinances or proxy ordinances. So if a person dies without ever hearing about the church, we can be baptized on their behalf, and then in the next life they'll be given the opportunity to join. I mean, it's not really join the Mormon Church anymore because it's in the afterlife, but but to come to God, or they can choose to reject it. So Orthodox Christians who've heard about Mormonism, on the other hand, I think that's good for God to work out. It seems like those who have only had a passing exposure to it and who don't join the church, I see no reason. And I think the position is that they probably will get a chance in the next life to join up with the saints, right? And it's not clear, if you have a bunch of exposure in this life, if you really investigate the church, you decide that it's false, is that enough for you to have had a chance, for justice to be filled? I don't know. That's for God to decide. But yeah, no, basically, non-Mormons absolutely will be in heaven. There's no question. If that's kind of the basic force behind that question.
Do you have any thoughts, Dustin?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I also agree that non-Mormons will be in heaven. So, I don't. I mean, if the question is what do I think about the general, what do I think about eschatology or whatever? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I lean universalist. I wouldn't claim to know that it's true though. I think it has to be that, people who don't get a fair chance at least get some sort of chance later on or whatever. So,
interesting. Well, I'm not a universalist, but we're not talking about that. So, okay. Here's a question from Emerson Green. He is asking a big question. But can Dustin give an outline of his own view of Christian scriptures as it relates to inspiration and inerrancy? I ask because it seems like there are factual errors in the Book of Mormon as well as the Bible. And then he talks about domestications of camels, historicity of the Exodus. Yeah,
I mean, I'm not a biblical inerrantist, so I'm pretty liberal, I guess. But I tried, maybe partly for this reason, not to saddle Joseph with Book of Mormon inerrancy, right? My claims were never things like the Book of Mormon says something historically false, so Mormonism has to be false. I think that would not be a good argument. There were things like, I don't think that the civilization that is supposed to have produced the plates existed, and that is a more serious worry, I think, because then what was Joseph Smith translating? So yeah, that's why I agree with Emerson that if you apply the same standard to the Bible, you'll also find some historical inaccuracies and stuff like that. And I don't think that's a problem as such in either case.
Yeah, and I'll say again, there are, kind of a fair number of Latter-day Saints who just say that the Book of Mormon is inspired fiction. And, obviously that's appealing because you don't have any problems with that, right? You just don't have to worry about the civilization, anachronism, or anything like that. So it's very easy to take that route. And so, it's probably seems dismissive of me to say, well, that just seems really implausible, especially because I'm talking about it's so easy to accommodate positions to different things. But, obviously the whole origin story of Mormonism and Joseph Smith is really tied up with this. Moroni, one of the characters in the Book of Mormon, is supposed to have come to him, right? So it really complicates things in a lot of ways. I think it's not worth the cost, right? Obviously you get the advantage of not having to worry about the empirical facts about, ancient America. But it undermines a lot of what I think is important about the Latter-day Saint truth claims, and so it just seems not to be a worthwhile view. And I don't know. I don't think it's irrational. I don't think it reconciles well at all with the way the church is structured or is supposed to have originated or anything like that. But it's an option, right? You can just kind of deny that there's any empirical problem at all, and people do it.
All right. Good. Here's another question. This one is from James Sheffield, and he asked, what can you falsify in Mormonism?
Yeah, so that was one worry I had about the kind of the way I've been talking tonight, is it sounds like I'm saying you can't falsify anything, right? I could just appeal to religious experience and be okay with that. And there's a sense in which, like, maybe that's kind of true. Like, I'm trying to think, like, yeah, so again, like, so it's okay. So think about how hard it is to decide what's rational in the case of, like, an alien abduction, right? So, like, most people, I think, don't really believe that there are a lot of people who have been abducted. Now imagine that you yourself, no, you're not mentally incapacitated in any way. You're not inebriated, right? And you are taken up, or you have this experience where it's like you're taken up in an alien spaceship, and they poke and prod you, and they bring you back down, and you go home, and you're like, wow, I just had this experience, and it turns out no time passed, right? So you thought you were up there for hours, and according to your clocks and everything, right, no time passed. So, like, is that enough to falsify the experience you had? That's like a really strong piece of evidence that it didn't happen, right? I don't know. My sense, maybe I'm biased, but my sense in that case, you would be justified in saying that you were actually abducted by aliens, even though you have no idea how it could be possible that apparently no time passed, right? So, like, you have a really strong piece of empirical evidence against it, but you have also this really vivid experience, and you have no reason to think it's not trustworthy in terms of, like, your mental state or anything. So I don't know. You can go either way there. So I think you can, in principle, build an empirical case against the LDS view, right? I think you could have enough empirical evidence, that sort of thing, to outweigh. Just, kind of, people give the analogy of putting it on a shelf and the shelf breaks eventually. I think that's in principle possible. I think there are people who leave the church who are rationally justified in doing so because they haven't had the religious experiences. So you can falsify anything in Mormonism, but, like, how easy is it to falsify on historical grounds for someone who's had really powerful religious experiences? I think very, very difficult. I think probably at that point, epistemically, it seems more likely that they'd have to have a religious experience that confirms that some other church is true, which happens. Right? People claim to have had religious experiences in favor of Mormonism, and then later have them for another church and leave for that church, right? So I mean, this just kind of comes down to kind of weighing different epistemic priorities, and it's tricky. But yeah, in principle, you can falsify anything. For some individuals, maybe it's not clear that there's, like, I don't know. You could certainly falsify ancillary claims, central claims. Maybe it'd be hard or nearly impossible to falsify on empirical grounds. Certainly in principle, I think that's possible. Maybe that's not how it doesn't happen in practice.
All right. I don't see any more questions, but I guess something that will be related to the last question would be, like, to you, like, what would it take for you to think that Mormonism is false? And same question for you, Dustin, as far as, like, what would it take for you to think that Christianity is false, like Orthodox Christianity?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's what I've thought about. Like, some people are okay, for instance, in classical theism, we're saying God can violate laws of logic, right? Probably an outright logical contradiction would be, maybe along with some other things, would be enough to convince me Mormonism is false. Like, I don't know that I can make sense of a logical contradiction being true. But as Dustin and I said earlier, what would that even look like, right? Really, what it would come down to is a contradiction that is based on some empirical fact, or maybe a philosophical argument, right? So, like, you could have arguments like the Kalam argument, which would contradict part of the Mormon cosmology, but even that, the Kalam argument, like the Hilbert-Sotelo argument, isn't a logical contradiction; it's metaphysical absurdity. So, like, if I had a religious experience or a series of religious experiences that were powerful, that convinced me that another tradition was true, that would certainly be enough for me, right? Because I'm basing my epistemology on religious experience. Maybe, I don't know, there's differences between, like, what would, as a matter of fact, convince me and what would make it rational for me to be convinced, right? So, like, maybe my threshold for what would convince me is not the same as what ought to convince me. Maybe I'm more stubborn than I should be, or maybe I'm less stubborn than I should be. So, it's hard to specify precisely what would be enough to convince me. Certainly religious experience, maybe is some sort of cumulative case with, like, philosophical arguments and empirical data. But that's less likely to me that sort of case is even possible, a strong enough case. But yeah, in principle, certainly.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I think there are a number of possible answers of sort of different sorts. I mean, I could imagine, thinking that the weight of philosophical arguments really strongly shows that God doesn't exist, or that God wouldn't behave the way that Christians say that he does. Or I could imagine, if there was really strong historical evidence suggesting that the resurrection didn't happen, or that, Jesus was, consciously fraudulent and was, putting people on and stuff. I mean, there are a number of things that I think would cause me to change my mind.
Yeah, and I agree with those. Like I said, in principle, it's hard for me. What would that evidence look like? What's really compelling evidence that Jesus wasn't resurrected, or really compelling evidence that he was fraudulent? That's kind of what's hard for me. Is like when you get specific, like we're talking like a document that purports to be written by Jesus. But then, how do we verify? So that's that's part of my trouble with kind of basing things on these historical questions. It's just so hard to know. Like, yeah, I don't know. I think you're right that they ought to be things that can in principle, but it's just hard to know what that would even look like in a lot of cases, right? But yeah, if Jesus wasn't resurrected, I think that would falsify Christianity and Mormonism, right? I think that's pretty clear cut. Not logically exclusionary, and you can say that Jesus wasn't the Son of God, but Christianity is true and good or something. But yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's pretty much it as far as like the questions go. Do you guys have any final thoughts? Joseph, since you just spoke, you can go ahead and just give your final thoughts. Anything you want to leave the audience with.
Sure. Yeah, no, I appreciate the opportunity to do this. Dustin, thanks for being a great conversation partner. This has been productive, I think. Yeah, I mean, I'm not an apologist in the sense of trying to convince people that Mormonism is true on rational grounds. But I am an apologist in the sense that I want to defend the rationality of my own position. I think it's at least plausible. Obviously, I can't convince you that I've had this experience, but it's plausible to say that on the basis of those, in the face of even very difficult historical questions, that it can be rational to be a Latter-day Saint. And I hope that I've expressed that in a way that makes sense to people. Yeah, but thanks, Dustin, for being charitable and Santi for having us on. But yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add. I think beyond what I've said, other than to say thank you both.
Yeah. I thought this was a lot of fun. So thanks.
All right. Well, with that, we'll leave you guys, and thank you so much for being here tonight. Don't forget to share, like, and subscribe. And if you guys thought that this conversation was helpful, definitely try to share it out there with other individuals. Thank you, Dustin. Thank you, Joseph, for having this conversation. I really appreciate the fact that both of you took the time to be here. And I think that there was really some good parts in which I think that we can agree on some core issues as far as the philosophy of religion and epistemology and stuff like that. So I know that there was somebody here who is a friend of mine, and he's an atheist, and it's good for him to hear other things, other perspectives, as well as listening to the philosophical ideas that go beyond just arguments and stuff like that, but more concentrated in religious experience and stuff like that. So thank you guys, and we'll see you guys until next time.